Welcome back to my channel. I'm continuing to talk today about why you should care if the gospel authors put their own words and their own interpretations into Jesus' mouth when he did not historically, recognizably say the things that they're reporting. And I'm focusing specifically here today on before Abraham was, I am, in the Gospel of John, and similarly, I and the Father are one in the Gospel of John. And I've called this video, Explicitness is Evidential. And I've done that because one of the emphases of the evangelical scholar who's going to be my foil here, Dr. Licona, is the claim that John made some things explicit about Jesus claiming to be God, which Jesus really only, or probably only, said implicitly. And I've talked before, I don't want to go into detail on this, but I've talked before about how this is not a matter of recognizable paraphrase. This isn't just about whether it was a verbatim account of everything that Jesus said and so forth, because in these passages, John 8, 58 and 10:30, the explicitness is the point. It's a deeply important feature of the whole scene. So if John is making something explicit, which Jesus said only in a very different way as found in the Synoptic Gospels in completely different scenes, then that would be invention. That wouldn't just be paraphrase, and I've emphasized that many times before. My point in this video is that explicitness has evidential force. And so it can't just come to the same thing if somebody is saying something in a sort of a veiled or guarded, implicit way, as opposed to saying it in an explicit way. That's going to change the evidential force. Now, this is kind of common sense, and I'm just going to give a analogy. Suppose that you're working for a third-party advisor, contractor with a corporation, and you're supposed to come in and conduct independent interviews with employees and survey procedures and so forth in order to give advice to the corporation. And one of the things you're doing is you're interviewing employees about how they feel about the management. You assure them that you're not going to tell the management, if someone criticizes them, who it was that criticized them and what exactly he said, but you are trying to, increase the efficiency and so forth of the company by finding out what the relations are like between the lower level employees and the management. So you're interviewing one of the employees, and in the course of it, he says something about his immediate superior manager, like, he and I get along fine. And then you try to keep it informal, and you're having this conversation, and a while later, as the conversation goes on, he says, I really liked Mr. Jones, our previous manager. He's no longer with the company. He was very considerate. Now, you may infer from this that there's a veiled criticism of the current manager, that maybe he's not as considerate, not as nice as the former manager, Mr. Jones, but the employee is saying it a roundabout way because he's not entirely sure that it's not going to get back to his current manager, so he's not coming right out and saying it. But by that very token, there's a certain amount of inference that has to go on, and in fact, you're not sure how strong of a criticism it was of his immediate manager. Is it just a mild criticism, or is it a strong criticism? Now, contrast that with a situation where you're talking with that employee, maybe on a different occasion, and the employee just comes right out and says, my immediate superior is a jerk. People find it hard to get along with him. He's not considerate. I get along with him okay. I kind of keep my head down, but he's not a kind manager at all. Now, there's no unclarity here. Explicitness and clarity are almost synonyms in this type of context, this type of verbal context. By being more explicit, he's being more clear. And that has evidential importance. You don't have to guess if he was criticizing, how much he was criticizing, and so forth. He's come right out and said it. And if he's interviewed multiple times on multiple occasions, you might have one time where he says it in the more veiled way and a different time where he says it in the more explicit way. Now, that example shows why it matters how explicit someone is. It matters to the evidence we have about what he's saying and what he means to say. Now, I often use Dr. Licona, and I also, to some extent, use Craig Evans as an example of some statements about John's historicity that calls it into question. If I remember, I'll include a link to some quotations from Dr. Craig Evans as well about this. And that shows you the goal of doing that, among other things, is to show you that just because someone is evangelical labeled and accepts an argument, that doesn't mean it's a good argument, okay? So I find two emphases in what Dr. Licona says about these implicit versus explicit claims to deity that Jesus made, or is reported as having made. On the one hand, he has an argument that he's used for years, and he brings it out in his most recent book as well, Jesus Contradicted, that the more explicit a deity claim is by Jesus, the more of a question we have about its historicity, because it's recognizable historicity, because he claims Jesus wouldn't have been that explicit. And he makes an argument from some of the ways that Jesus tries to keep his messiahship a secret and then tries to carry that over to deity claims. So he leans strongly against the recognizable historicity of before Abraham was I am for that reason. Okay, so this places explicitness and historicity in a sort of inverse relationship as far as probability is concerned. The more explicit some reported saying, the more doubt we should have about its recognizable historicity. Okay, so there's that inverse relationship. All right, but his other emphasis is, hey, it doesn't matter anyway, because it comes to the same thing. And there's such strong Christology in Mark. He likes to stick to Mark, I think, because that's even more acknowledged by critical scholars and so forth. So the Christology is so strong, the way Jesus presents himself in Mark, that it doesn't really matter what questions we might have about before Abraham was I am, and I and the Father are one in John, because it comes to the same thing. Now, I don't know if you can see that there's a tension here. Maybe you can see it right away. Maybe the whole rest of this video will be irrelevant to you, though you might like to hear how I spell it out, but there really is a tension. I'm going to first read a couple of quotes. I'll try to keep this short. First one is from Jesus Contradicted, pages 44 to 45. He's been talking about Jesus ordering people not to say that he's the Messiah. Now, if Jesus was hesitant to announce publicly and plainly that he is the Messiah, we would not expect for him to be claiming to be God publicly and as plainly as we observe John reporting him saying, before Abraham was I am. Of course, this could be a rare exception to the rule. However, if Jesus did not make such explicit claims in public, what might be going on in John's gospel? So, what might be going on is these literary devices, and they were allowed, and loose paraphrase, etc., etc. But you can tell the direction he's leaning. He goes on to say, well, we can't rule it out, but this could be a rare exception to the rule. So he's not absolutely committing himself to saying it didn't happen, but he's definitely leaning in that direction. Reasoning from Jesus' attempts to hide his messiahship, at least for a while, in the Gospels. I have another video I did on that. I'm definitely going to link to that in the show notes. The problems with that messianic secret argument. The very, very short version is that there's a difference between claiming to be the Messiah and claiming to be God. And actually, we can see an even stronger reason for Jesus to be cautious about announcing it widely that he claims to be the Messiah than saying in public that he's God. So it doesn't, those two are not related in the way that Dr. Licona thinks they are. But what I'm pointing out here is that this is that inverse relationship claim. You know, that it's because the claims are, in a sense, too explicit in John. And that contradicts what Jesus was trying to do with the messianic secret. So we should have some doubts about that recognizable historicity. All right. But then a quote that shows this other emphasis. Now, he's been doing this on interviews recently. This quote that's, I think, pretty strongly the kind of thing is actually from a debate with Bart Ehrman some years ago, and I'll link it. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he, speaking of Mark, wants to capture those events that illustrate who this person is. So now he goes through chapter after chapter of Mark and shows Jesus supposedly indicating that he's God by his actions and in these implicit ways. Some of them are much weaker than others. Claiming to be able to forgive sins in Mark 2, I think that's pretty strong. Still not as explicit as what we find, still not as clear as what we find in John. But some of them are very weak, claiming that he's stronger than Satan. I mean, a messenger from God could easily be stronger than Satan in Mark 3. Comparing his walking on the water to Job 9:8, because only God walks on the water. Well, I mean, that's clearly, you want to talk about genre, that's clearly anthropomorphic metaphor in Job. So at the most, it would be kind of a strange pun, which, by the way, Jesus never says. Like, ooh, you know, little Easter egg for you here. Job says God alone walks on the water. Of course, he didn't really mean God literally has feet and walks on the water. But here I am, Jesus, I literally have feet and I'm literally walking on the water. Cool, huh? I mean, there's no indication to that effect. So some of these are pretty weak. But then he summarizes, all right? John takes what Jesus would have said and done implicitly, and he restates it in an explicit manner. So did Jesus actually make some of these divine claims explicitly, word for word, like he does in John? Momentary aside, word for word is a red herring. We've already discussed that. Okay, back to the quote. Who knows? But whether he did or not is irrelevant. He still made claims through his actions and the things that he did that came to the same thing, same conclusion. So there's that other emphasis. First, we've got the emphasis, this is too explicit in John, and that throws question on its historicity. But the other emphasis is, hey, it's just as clear in Mark anyway, so it's irrelevant whether or not he said the stuff clearly that is found in John. What's the tension here? Well, because if it really does come to the same thing, you know, if walking on water, claiming to be able to forgive sins, claiming to be stronger than Satan, and these other things that Jesus says in Mark really, literally come to the same thing, to the point that it's irrelevant whether, you know, it's evidentially irrelevant whether Jesus said the things recorded in John, then the same doubt should be able to be cast on Mark. If it were just some kind of code that the minute Jesus said he was stronger than Satan, everybody would go, oh my goodness, he's claiming to be God. You know, like that was just like going to be instantly recognized. It was the super well-known clear code. Well, then I guess we should doubt that that's historical, because if Jesus hid his messiahship, he wouldn't have said this in so clear a manner. Now, of course it's not as clear. Of course it doesn't come to the same thing. But you can't have both. Pick one. Either it really is just as strong of evidence that Jesus thought he was God and that Jesus presented himself as God, in which case you need to give up your messianic secret argument, because apparently he wasn't averse to being super clear about being God. Or it is quite implicit, not as clear, in which case it doesn't come to the same thing, and it's not irrelevant because the John statements are stronger. They are better evidence that Jesus was claiming to be God. Now, I think it's very clear that it doesn't come to the same thing. Notice here, by the way, there's a difference between emphasizing Christology in the Synoptics as part of a case where you're actually going to accept what's in John. So you're using both of these as prima facie historical, okay? And Jesus presents himself in this exalted way in the Synoptics, and then you're putting that together with the reports in John, which you think are historical, you think John is reliable, etc., to say, hey, Jesus really thought he was God. That's one thing. But it's quite another to place them at odds with one another, to say, no, Jesus, if he's implicit like this, he's cautious like this, he's not going to be explicit like this over here. Those are very different arguments. Don't conflate them. Now let's go back to the employee example. Suppose that you did have these two different interviews with the same employee, and on the one occasion he said kind of in this roundabout way, not clear how much he's criticizing his superior, and then on another occasion he just lets her rip. Just comes out and says, my immediate supervisor is a jerk. People find him really hard to get along with, etc. And suppose you said, well, that second one is dubiously historical because look how cautious he is this time over here. He's apparently afraid of retaliation. Well, if he's that cautious over here, he probably wouldn't be this explicit over here. And that's a pretty poor argument. He might just be in a different mood on the later occasion, or maybe he is taking another job and he figures he has nothing to lose. Whatever. There could be all kinds of reasons. And if anything, the two should be thought of as working together. But if you make that argument, then you have to admit that the second statement is better evidence of his attitude toward his manager and what he thinks of that manager. It's just common sense. All right, explicitness really is helpful. And this should be clear. Quote-unquote biblical Unitarians, Muslims, Jehovah's Witnesses, they have a harder time explaining away the statements in John. Now, they think they can explain them away, but it gets more strained. It gets more difficult. And let's not forget that if someone is an Arian, A-R-I-A-N, an Arian, he has an exalted view of God. In fact, so-called biblical Unitarians have an exalted view of Jesus Christ. Arians have an exalted view of Jesus Christ. I'm not saying that they're necessarily Arians, but if they are, that it's okay to worship him in some sense. That the poet Milton was an Arian, and that's well documented. If you read Paradise Lost, you can't tell. All right, the Son is a created being in there, but he doesn't really emphasize that. And the Son is pre-existent. He expresses the image of his Father's face and all of this stuff, okay? So Jesus having an exalted view of himself can be accommodated within these heretical views, but is actually claiming to be God, the I am, okay? That's harder. And so I think we have that instinct, and that's why, and it's a right instinct, and that's why those passages in John are so often used as evidence that Jesus had this view of himself, that he was indeed claiming to be God. So explicitness is evidential. Explicitness matters. Explicitness is not epistemically irrelevant. So if you even if you think there's an implied high Christology in the Gospel of Mark, that's not going to be the same as a explicit, non-implied high Christology as far as your evidence about what Jesus thought of himself. I would add, I don't think I've already said this in this video, that I think baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost at the end of Matthew, that's going to be pretty hard for these other heretical groups and Muslims to get around. I think that's pretty high. Still not quite up there as high as I and the Father are one, and before Abraham was, I am. And by saying it's not as high, I don't mean that it's in conflict. I just mean it's not as clear, not as explicit. But generally, you don't find that when someone wants to argue for high Christology in the Synoptics, that they go to that text. And I think this is because of a sort of instinct that they want to use Mark as much as possible because of critical scholarship. So with that common sense notion in mind, we can see why you should care if John took some things that Jesus said implicitly and made them explicit, meaning making up his stating clearly his unity with the Father. That's a big deal as far as our evidence for Jesus' self-concept. Next time, we're going to be coming back and talking a bit about multiple attestation and why multiple attestation doesn't make it just unimportant if the gospel authors put their own words in Jesus' mouth. I hope all of this has been helpful and commonsensical, because that's our goal here at the Lydia Miggert channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.